with and personal with some of the brightest minds in Boston, and I say that with all sincerity. I'm going to, first of all, introduce our panel. We have Councillor Andrea Campbell, Councillor Anissa Asabi-George, Chief Economic Development for Boston, John Barrels, and Representative John Santiago. And I can say as a journalist that there is nothing, very few things that are as important as data and research, particularly since we're living in what some would like to call a post-truth age. The whole notion of post-truth in itself is frightening. And so that is precisely why we need data. That's precisely why we need research to back up those things that are essentially incontrovertible, that cannot be contested just by saying, I disagree with it, and positing your own truth, your own objective reality when it basically makes no sense. Given that Boston is blessed with such a rich research community, we have experts and centers focused on any number of topics. I want to know how do you foresee the role of research, data, and technology, including collaboration with local research institutions under your administration? Additionally, given the successes under the Menino and Walsh administrations of new offices, like the Mayor's Office of New Urban Mechanics and Citywide Data Analytics team, I want to know, how do you foresee your administration actualizing these sorts of partnerships and the lessons that arise from them? I'd like you to keep that in mind as we begin our discussion in earnest. And I think the first topic I'd like to focus on, for a lot of reasons, including the fact that the first anniversary of the George Floyd murder is coming up next Tuesday. So I'd like to focus initially on policing. You will note that this is a blank slide. There is no slide here. That is because there are a lot of data on policing and law enforcement that are not being released or being released episodically. These include body-worn camera videos and associated metadata, use of force incidents, field interrogation and observation records, also known as stop and frisk, and certainly a lot of kids know that name more so than field interrogation and observation, gang database records, and officer discipline records. I'm going to ask this question initially, then we'll start the order the same way we began. What sorts of data do you believe the city should be leveraging and making available to best inform and further police reform? And how would you like the research community to help you analyze them? And we begin with Councillor Campbell.
Thank you. I don't know if there's a clock or not. I think we're
well, let's consider that we have several questions, about 5 we're going to try to get in within a short amount of time. So if everyone could take maybe 2 minutes to answer a very difficult question, that would be great.
Thank you, Philip, and thank you to everyone for hosting this incredible conference, and of course, for the opportunity to participate. And thank you for the work that each and every one of you do in partnership with government, but also for the larger community in the city of Boston. So this issue of policing reform and criminal legal reform is personal to me. The very reason I got into office and ran for a political office was after losing my twin brother, Andre, who I talk about all the time. This year marks 9 years since he passed away while in the custody of the Department of Correction, which oversees our prisons here in Massachusetts, when he was 29 years old. And he was a pretrial detainee. He had a disease called scleroderma, and as a result of receiving inadequate healthcare while in that system, would pass away at a young age. So when I got to the council, the work of policing reform and criminal legal reform for me required a sense of urgency and action. I chaired the Committee on Public Safety and Criminal Justice. I still do as a counselor. And I often say I did not need to see the painful murder of George Floyd to know that our police department needed major reforms and needed to be more transparent, more accountable, more diverse, and more equitable, of course. As a city councilor, I have been a leader in reforming the police system, pushing for this department to be all of those things. And for years, similar to your point, Philip, I had to subpoena our own police department for stop and frisk data. In one year, we found that 70% of the police stops done by the police department were Black residents, even though we only make up a quarter of the population. But if I'm in the system and I have to subpoena our department, it tells you we lack significant transparency. 1 year I drafted, or 3 years ago, I drafted a report to improve the diversity in our department and was demanding that the police department release data on the demographics of our officers. Who are the women, people of color? That information has still yet to be made public on a public safety dashboard. Body cameras. I was in the courtroom pushing for implementation of body cameras by the city of Boston, literally fighting one of the unions for body cameras to actually be realized in this city. And I drafted the legislation when it comes to creating a civilian review board in the Office of Police Accountability and Transparency. So I will continue to lead on these issues, which I know are critically important. When it comes to the data, as mayor, if I'm blessed to become the next elected mayor in the city of Boston, I would establish an open data initiative. And there are a whole bunch of ideas in specifics on my website that folks can review, but that would make sure that all of this information, police stops, stop and frisk, traffic stops, our FIO data, the BRIC, gang database, all of the disparities in this, all of this information that is currently within the department is proactively released on this dashboard. And then I would push everyone on this Zoom, I would partner with the organizations in this ecosystem in Boston to analyze that data, but most importantly, to do it across various departments, to look at what are the patterns, especially those that lead to racial disparities, and what are the solutions we should offer up that would solve for them. And so we'll continue to push for all of these things in partnership with each and every one of you.
Councilor Campbell, thank you very much. Continuing in alphabetical order, Councilor Sabi George, that same question for you, and perhaps I should repeat the question itself, not the entire thing, but the question: what sorts of data do you believe the city should be leveraging and making available to best inform and further police reform? And how would you like the research community, this very rich research community, to help you analyze them?
No, it's great. And I appreciate this opportunity to have the conversation about the number of things we'll discuss today, including reform, but in particular, data collection, and the very important partnerships that we need to make sure that we're taking advantage of, because this city is rich in resources and knowledge and institutional power and thoughtfulness around this work. And as Dan mentioned in his opening, there is certainly a great deal of work to be done. And I think that this is work we certainly have to do together in order to get through it. You know, when we think about policing, when we think about the work that we have to do here in the city of Boston, Boston certainly has an opportunity to implement some significant reforms and demonstrate the benefit of accountability and transparency to truly lead on this effort and the work. When we think about data in particular, it's really important that the data we are measuring is good data and that we are always managing the fidelity of that data. And we can certainly improve, use that data and use the sharing of that data and the transparency of that data. Of course, it has to be good data to improve trust between our communities and law enforcement and our policing community. Certainly, we've seen the benefit of body cameras, and we have to work to make sure that we are releasing body camera footage pretty quickly, and certainly as a first step post a significant incident here in the city of Boston. We can also make sure that other data is available to the public, like the statistics around arrests and police stops, that we're tracking crime rates in every single community, and making sure that that data is accessible, because good data is only usable and provides that, you know, that transparency when it's accessible by the public. As mayor, I will certainly push for the critical reforms, including expanding implicit bias training and making sure that we have access to appropriate care, and that we, again, are measuring and sharing that information about that care, especially when we think about our mental health response and how important it is. And then what we're doing internally around the gang database and what we're doing externally around community outreach. I think it's so important for sure that our Boston Police Department reflect our communities across the city of Boston, that the diversity of our city is reflected in the diversity of our workforce, and that we are working every day to increase diversity across the department as a whole, but certainly within our specialized units, especially when we think about leadership and also considering the not just racial diversity, but gender diversity across those fields. So we've got work to do, and it certainly has to be based in data, and in partnership, and collecting data is really important, but we have to make sure that it's good data.
Councilor Sabi George, thank you very much. Again, continuing alphabetically, John Barrows, that same question to you about policing and the use of data. How would you use this data?
You know, Philip, first, let me thank you for facilitating the conversation. I want to thank Dan and his team at Bari and all of the sponsors that he read. It's important. It's important that we, as a city, use this amazing ecosystem that we have. We're lucky to have so many institutions of higher education. We're lucky to have renowned healthcare facilities, researchers, development labs, cutting edge technology. But it doesn't matter if we can't use it to improve situations for people in Boston. The most important thing for Boston is to bring that ecosystem together to solve really big problems. As Chief of Economic Development, I partnered with a lot of institutions in Boston, and we conducted research for two different reasons. One was to think about the kinds of policies we wanted to put in place, and then the other one was to measure the kind of impact that we were able to have, and then to adjust, scale up, or eliminate things that we were doing that we shouldn't do. It is time for us to use everything we have to improve policing. Policing is right now paramount in the conversation for how we address racism, how we address issues that people are dealing with, that people have been dealing with for a very long time, that cause trauma, and in fact don't help move the needle in building a safe community for everyone, and building a community where people are feeling best served and protected. And so the data that we need to make available, first and foremost, we've seen the impact of the camera videos. If we did not have a video of the George Floyd murder, my guess is we would not have a conviction, and the atrocities would continue to happen. We need the camera videos. We need them available. We need to fully implement the body cameras in the Boston Police Department. Not everyone is wearing it yet. That's not acceptable. We need to also provide the associated metadata that is used with videos so that we can do appropriate analysis. And then we need to make sure that we have available the force incidents. What are the use of force incidents in our city? Where? What's happening? Who's being interrogated on the streets? How often? What neighborhoods? We need to also make sure that we have observation data, right? This is, whether it's stop and frisk or other ways that people do observation, we need to have that. And then I think, it's not just about the metadata and the numbers. It's also about the stories, right? And I know the gang database, there's so many sort of, let's say, soft data, soft observations that are used to create that kind of database. That needs to be done in partnership with community. It works best that way. We need to know, we need to have conversations about what's happening there. We need to reform the way that it happens, because just because, and I remember this doing the work I did at the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative, just because you might be hanging on a corner doesn't mean that you're associated, but people get lumped into groups and it's not fair. We also need to make sure that officer discipline records are transparent. We have to have zero tolerance on bad actors in our law enforcement community. That needs to be transparent. Internal affair records need to be public so that we understand, particularly where there are sustained findings or any disciplinary action that's taken because of an incident. The public needs to know. So we have to have a database for police infractions. It is essential that is made public and people are made accountable for their actions. As mayor, I will continue to work with the research institutes and the different partners in our city, and work with residents to make sure that the stories and the anecdotal data sets are available to continue to inform the numbers and bring context to them so that we can be a better city for everyone.
Okay. Candidate John Barrows, thank you. Representative John Santiago, you've heard the responses here. You've thought about this question, especially as we are close to the date that George Floyd was killed a year ago. What are your thoughts on the uses of data, technology, research that's being provided by research organizations here in Boston in the context of policing?
Great. Well, thank you, Philip, for the question. And it's great to be here this morning with my fellow candidates. And for those out there who are participating in, research writ large all across the city of Boston, it's important work that you do because without question, research, educational, medical institutions all across Boston play an important role in educating us. And as a physician, scientist, I mean, my life has been about data. I'm married to a scientist. You'll often find me knee deep in research papers, trying to inform my policy and my decision making. But it's also important at the same time that and I thought about this a lot in terms of my transition from medicine to the political scene, right? That we understand the limitations of data, right? And particularly its relationship with politics, because I often say that, data informing policy and politics are two different things, right? One appeals to the brain and to the intellect, the other to the heart, right? And so I think it's incumbent upon us, and I think it's my task, your task, the research institutions out there, to really understand that relationships. Because, for me in the emergency room, when we're talking about a patient, it is always 95% strictly data-based, evidence-based, right? We come up with plans, options based on XYZ studies. And then if I were to take that same strategy and those arguments to the State House to put forth an argument on a piece of legislation, I find myself getting zero traction, right? I find myself having to tell a story of one, an N of one, which, in research world really doesn't mean much. So I think it's important that we think about data, in a very comprehensive way, and that our job is really how do we translate that data, that policy, and taking into account the politics of it to move forward. And I think when you talk about police, it's something that you're absolutely right. Data has to be a part of the equation here. And there's no question that, we need to take a hard look at it when we come up with our criminal justice response. And it has to be deliberative, thoughtful, and really community oriented. And a lot of issues that we're facing across the country right now, not just with respect to Boston, but states and cities, across the board, have to do with transparency and accountability. And I do believe, we can hold folks better accountable if we're more transparent. And there's a lot of data out there that I would like to see put forward and be put public. Obviously, that is de-identified, but in a data set that folks in the community, advocates, the city, stakeholders will have access to in order to, make some informed opinions. And for me, I think that I'm particularly interested in, and what I would love the research community to answer is, thoughts on minimum staffing levels, particularly in this context of, this defund the police notion, right? I'm not a believer in, 3-word phrases to solve complex problems, regardless of the situation. But I think it's important that we understand what minimum staffing levels are in the police department, right? So, as mayor, I'm going to put forth a budget that is thoughtful, that is, community oriented, and that reflects the needs and the desires of each and every neighborhood. But I want to understand what minimum staffing levels are, because my interpretation and understanding of it as it stands right now is that those are largely historically based, right? Those are largely conversations, with policemen, officers, people in the field determining those, right? But what if we had more informed research, right? What if we could point to statistics, to have a better idea how we create minimum staffing levels? Therefore, it would make our job easier, my job easier as a future mayor, to put forth a budget with XYZ police in order to do the mission that they need to do. And I think the opposite is true as well. And whether you see an increase in the budget or a decrease in the budget, it'll be driven by the data. And so to me, that's an important way to involve research institutions into the police force. The second thing that I'd be very interested in understanding. Go ahead.
If I could, John, I'm sorry. If we're going to try to move into the next question, so if you
sure.
could just please, go ahead.
No, you can go ahead.
All right. Yeah. Well, you have described a comprehensive way of using data, all of you, and by the way, Midwest, we say data. I know folks around here say data. But that Midwestern thing still lingers over me. Always a Detroit Lions fan. Let's move to this next comprehensive issue of affecting so many people, housing. I spoke to a woman in Dorchester recently who has 3 children. Her biggest concern come September She's okay at the moment, but come September, she will likely lose her home. She will likely be evicted. And this is a huge issue, as we know, in a city where housing is so expensive and disparities are so wide. Evictions have been a major concern for lower income residents, particularly both nationally and locally, especially within the context of the mass job and income loss due to the pandemic. In a recent report, the Boston Area Research Initiative and Metropolitan Area Planning Council showed that corporate landowners, especially those that own over 100 units, account for a disproportionate amount of evictions locally. My question to you, how would you work with these entities to limit the impact of eviction on Boston's most vulnerable, especially as we still grapple with the uneven impacts of the pandemic? Again, what more would you like to know? Let's start again alphabetically, and Councillor Campbell, if you will. And folks, if you can keep it to 2 minutes, that would be great. Thank you.
Thank you, Philip, for the question. So you spoke about a constituent in Dorchester. They're probably in my district. My biggest neighborhoods are Dorchester and Mattapan. And as we sit on this Zoom, people are facing increases in rent as well as eviction. And so it's a major issue. And we know, of course, how traumatic it is on residents, especially residents of color and low income residents. But we also know it can lead to homelessness, which of course exacerbates that issue for the city of Boston, costing us more money. So it is essential that we prevent these evictions in the first place and do the hard work now before the issue gets worse. A few different things based on the data, and I have to give a shout out to MAPC, where I used to work as a general counsel, where they taught me the importance of data, of course, but also a regional lens and using a regional approach to every issue that we do, which frankly, we don't do that well in the city of Boston, and something I would do if I'm blessed to become the next elected mayor in the city. But one is just supporting the eviction moratoriums during the recovery from the pandemic. We saw some success and some relief for residents when the moratorium existed, have been fighting for that. I think it's important that it continue to be a part of the conversation as a solution and an immediate solution to help families. I think the second piece, of course, is working with these corporate landlords. And because we have this data, we can be really targeted. And that's a really good thing. And of course, have a great impact if we are indeed targeted. And that can involve mediation sessions between landlords and tenants. I've found some success in doing some of that with some of my tenants. And also at the same time, working with landlords on solutions to help move folks into more permanent housing solutions. For example, homeownership opportunities. There's a program that I fought for that is currently within the Boston Housing Authority that is actually allowing families, and these are usually low income or no income residents, have stability in their homes, move from public housing and into homeownership opportunities. These programs and initiatives could be expanded. And frankly, with corporate landlords, maybe they would be willing to subsidize some of these ideas as a way to help stabilize permanently the situation of residents dealing with eviction. The third piece I will say is, of course, long-term solutions are critically important. Creating more affordable housing, absolutely necessary in the city of Boston. And I have a whole host of ideas on that. And that could be a whole separate Zoom on how we can absolutely do that in the city of Boston, and ensuring as we're building this affordable housing that it is in the hands and owned by people in these communities, especially communities of color and low income residents. In terms of what I would want to know more of, it is the demographics of the households. Are they single family homes? Are they single mom homes, for example? And we know when you invest in mothers, single mothers, you see the benefits that you reap are incredible. I would want to know the income situation, the job status of residents dealing with this, to have a holistic approach on response. Because usually if someone's facing an eviction, there's economic instability there that we need to solve for. Maybe we need financial coaching, of course, and other tools. And there's some of these programs that exist right now that are helping move people into homeownership opportunities that are doing all of the above, not just in terms of putting people into permanent housing, but also helping them get economic stability and moving them out of poverty. And they find that it's important to have more data on the household as well. And so I would push for more of that information, particularly from these corporate landlords, if possible, and to drive a solution that's in partnership with the entities we're speaking of.
Councilor Campbell, thank you very much.
I hope that was 2 minutes.
That was it was a little bit longer, but that's all right. You did well. Councilor Sabi George, what about yourself? Again, briefly, and that all important question at the very end. Again, what more would you like to know?
Right. No, it's great. And I appreciate the question. And Astro says hello. Someone must be at the back door. You know, it's certainly settled science when we think about the cost of living here in the city of Boston. We know our families, our residents are struggling to pay rent and can't afford or can't find affordable, stable housing here in the city of Boston. I've led the work on the Boston City Council around supporting our families experiencing homelessness, our residents who are unsheltered and experiencing homelessness find that permanent housing. And it is difficult to do. We certainly need help in creating more opportunities for affordable housing and truly affordable housing across our city. It's also really important that we are continuing to look for ways to create paths to home ownership. When we think about stabilizing an individual, when we think about stabilizing a family, when we think about stabilizing a community, it is through home ownership. When we think about the wealth gap, we think about the legacy that you leave for your family and what you create for your family. It is very directly tied to home ownership. And we need to make sure that we're always striving and looking for ways to create more ownership opportunities across our city, but in particular for our communities of color, for our neighbors, for our residents who again are unstably housed. The cost of rent in the city of Boston is often much more than the price tag of a mortgage. And we need to do, when we think about the opportunities for partnership, the city of Boston needs to lead on these issues, and on this work, but we need to do it in partnership with others. We should not go at it alone. We need to partner with those that have certain expertise that can leverage their roles within our communities to help our residents access that stable housing, create that more affordable and truly affordable housing, but in the end, look to create more pathways to home ownership.
What would you like to know from the research groups involved in collecting this data?
Yeah, no, we actually held a hearing on this just a couple of weeks ago. I called for a deeper understanding around the diversity of our units across our city. What do we have when it comes to studios and 1 bedrooms and 2 bedrooms and 3 bedrooms? Who's occupying those? We need help identifying that information because a 3-bedroom is designed for families, but we see 3 individual adults occupying that space. And we need to create more family-sized housing here in the city of Boston. So fully understanding the diversity of our housing stock across our city and all of our neighborhoods, understanding who's in that housing stock, how much they're paying for that housing stock, and how do we create different pathways for families in particular, because Boston is, too quickly looking like a place that's not welcoming to families. I have 4 children and a dog, as you know, and we have to create more opportunities for our families to live here in the city of Boston and make their home here in the city of Boston.
Councilor Sabi George, thank you very much. John Barrows, that question for you, evictions, we're seeing they're going to speed up as the pandemic winds down. I shouldn't say, well, let's hope it winds down. It seems to be winding down, but as things seem to be getting better, at the same time, people are losing their homes. How would you address this issue? And that all important question also, what more would you like to know in terms of data?
Philip, thanks for asking the question. Housing is critical. And anyone who becomes mayor, and if I had the opportunity to become mayor, housing is an important part of how we stabilize families, but how we stabilize cities and who we are as a city. Before the pandemic, housing was too expensive in Boston, and it was creating a lot of movement, a lot of displacement. Some say gentrification in different parts, and I think the data shows it. There were a lot of, the data that we looked at the city showed that there were a lot of pressures in certain areas. There were a lot of pressures within certain strands of income in our city. And so this is something that we need to continue to focus on, because sometimes, housing policy, as much as you think are intuitive, it doesn't create the kinds of changes and trends that we typically think it does in terms of approaches. We know that the average person that was evicted before the pandemic was owing about $1,500. And what is it now? What is it now for the pandemic? We believe that the way to address the issue of evictions after the moratorium, or at least I believe, and my colleagues in the housing space that I worked with at the city, that it has to be, that the response has to be direct financial assistance. We need to have a better sense for what the arrears are. We need to have a better sense for how much we would need to come up with, because as soon as the moratorium is lifted, we might have some huge problems. We already saw 2 weeks ago the data that was released to show that there's more homeless on the streets of Boston. We already saw that we've got a problem that we've got to deal with. We already know that we don't have enough supply for permanent transitional housing for our homeless. We need to increase the productivity there. But what is going to happen, and how do we model? How do we model what the bubble would look like after the moratorium is lifted, what the costs might be to help mitigate that lift, and then how our approach then can respond to that? I think these are things that we need to know. And as mayor, that I would like to know. I'd also like to figure out some kind of spatial impacts. All of our neighborhoods are not made the same when you think about who's renting. In fact, many of our neighborhoods have huge disparity in terms of, if you look at owner-occupied units. I know that, a place like West Roxbury, you've got about 64% of the units there are owner-occupied. Hyde Park has a high percentage close to West Roxbury, Rosendale, Jamaica Plain. But when you look at neighborhoods like Roxbury at 19%, Longwood, Mission Hill, Fenway, those are really low percentage owner-occupied neighborhood. What happens, and how do we model the impact for that neighborhood when the moratorium is lifted? And then what are the responses to that we need? Those are the kinds of partnerships that we could have with the research community here in Boston, so that we can make sure we're ready to appropriate some of the money that's coming to the city, that the city is getting, so that we can address the impact of COVID. Are we being strategic enough in how we're planning to use that money? I dare say we're not. We need to have more information. We need to do more modeling for what could happen in the future, and then how to mitigate some of that.
Okay, John, thank you very much. John Barrows, candidate for mayor. We now turn to Representative John Santiago. Representative Santiago, so this question again around evictions. How would you basically use this, the information, how would you work with research entities to limit the impact of eviction on Boston's most vulnerable?
Well, I thanks, Philip. I would agree with a lot of the sentiments that my fellow candidates have stated. I think the blurb of the question was talking about the large landowners, right? And the fact that those landowners who own over 100 units are more likely to evict their tenants. I would submit to you to say that perhaps we need a little bit more research. What is the next step? I think it's important to understand why these large landlords decided to do that versus the smaller landlords. And for me, as a scientist, I kind of have two hypotheses, right? Are large corporate, landlords, do they have less local ties, or that perhaps vis-a-vis some of the small landlords, they have enough resources to withstand, loss of payment versus some of the smaller ones. I don't know, but I think it's something that we should look into, because it's important. And it'll inform me as the next mayor to decide what levers we need to push and pull, depending on if they're small landlords or large landlords. So I think it's important that we take a look at it. And that's some of the information that I would depend wholly on in research institutions across the city of Boston, because I think that's going to guide us in terms of just writing and implementing policy. The other info that I'd like to know is, what are the last 6 to 9 months look like before a family or a person is evicted? What are the risk factors, the demographics, what are the factors associated with that eviction, right? Because I think if you can be very proactive in terms of your response, you'll be better for it. We know that as soon as families get evicted, it is so much more difficult to get them back in the system, to get them a place to stay, to restart that process. But what if we were more proactive in our response? And as mayor of Boston, having an Office of Housing Stability that is very proactive, doubling down on resources to make sure that they're directly going after those, 3 to 4 factors that are most associated with eviction, I think we'll be better for it. And as someone who understands the importance of housing, someone who voted to pass one of the most progressive, eviction moratoriums in the country. And I'm committed to doing, because right now housing is a crisis in Boston, and we need a mayor who's going to use that research and to put action forward and get things done.
Representative Santiago, thank you. All of you have raised, in the context of your answers, have raised really great questions as well.
Philip, can I add one more thing? Just when I hear all of our responses and sort of the ties that certainly bind us and the interests and concerns that certainly bind us, we as a city and as a state and as a region have access to so much data. I don't think we have a lack of data. I think where we have our greatest challenge in all of these cases is we need some help bringing that data together and making sense of that data, making sure that it is good, that it is properly measured, and then properly used to inform decisions, whether it's around policing, whether it's around housing. And I think that that's a real place where we could use some additional help when we think about the work of government, when we think about the work of government in partnership with others.
Well, the great thing about this conference and this gathering and the work that Dan O'Brien and others have done is, David Braid and others, is that you are bringing that information to bear, and it's available for you, both as candidates, but certainly when one of you becomes mayor of one of 4 of 6 or 7 at this point, who may become mayor. This information will be absolutely and continues to be valuable. One other focus among those that we will try to get in during our remaining time, it's now 10:17, is education. It's screaming for it's screaming for some type of remedy. We have racial and social economic inequities in Boston public schools, and that's nothing new, of course. This graph from the Boston Schools Fund highlights them for the specific case of high school graduation rates, with Asian and white students experiencing markedly higher rates of graduation than their Black and Latinx counterparts. Now, graduate rates are also depressed for those who are economically disadvantaged, have high needs or disabilities. Here's the question, folks. What will your administration do to counteract these sorts of inequities? What more do you feel needs to be studied to chart a strong course forward? Again, we start alphabetically. Councilor Campbell.
No problem. First of all, I appreciate this question in the slide. I'm a BPS kid. I went to 5 Boston public schools from pre-K to the 12th grade. I'm a mom. I have 2 boys living in Mattapan. I care deeply about the educational inequities because frankly, they're getting worse and not better. And I'll give you one stat. I live in Mattapan and my boys have a 5% chance of getting into a high quality Boston public school compared to certain downtown neighborhoods where it's 80%. I talked earlier in the program about my twin brother, Andre, and how we went in 2 separate directions. And the question I ask is, how do 2 twins born and raised in the city of Boston have such different life outcomes? So I have focused on improving Boston public schools since I got to the council, because I recognize that many of the opportunities that were afforded me in that system were absolutely not afforded Andre, and of course continue not to be afforded to thousands of Bostonians to this day. I frankly do not think we need any more data from BPS. We have a lot of data and we have a lot of money. This is an over $1 billion system that's about to receive $400 million from the federal government. It is time for action and to operate with a sense of urgency and political leadership. This is the number one reason, one of the number one reasons I jumped into this mayor's race back in September when we didn't know what our last mayor was going to be doing, because of the inaction with respect to Boston public schools and the fact that it's getting worse. I put out a report now it's maybe almost 3 years old, called Action for Boston Children, keyword action, because of the lack of action, and pushing for a few different things. And it took 6 months to develop that with a whole host of folks, including many folks on this Zoom. And we said, where do we start? So as mayor, frankly, I would dust that plan off and implement it because I did not have the authority to do that as a counselor. The first is universal pre-K. Yes, we're talking about graduation rates, but we do not need another report to talk about the foundation of learning is essential. If we do not invest in universal pre-K and get it right from birth to 5 years old, we will continue to fail our families. There is a way with this robust ecosystem in the city of Boston to realize, I should say, universal pre-K. The second is high school redesign. We've been talking about high school redesign forever. There are many reports. You can find them. They're probably sitting on the shelves at City Hall. We dusted those reports off and incorporated what we learned from those reports in my plan. And we talked about the importance of creating pathways for our young people. What do they dream of for themselves? Not pie in the sky. Literally, you want to be a scientist, you want to be a doctor, a lawyer. What classes do you need to take? How do we get you internships, mentors, opportunities for college credits and certifications while you're in BPS? All of this is possible. I had it at Latin school. We need to afford that to our young folks. So this high school redesign question, make it happen already. And then the last piece, I don't care what plan it is, no solution, whether it's greater diversity in our teachers, more supports for English learners or special needs students, you name it. If we do not transform the district and make the district more transparent and accountable to the families and remind our district that we're not accountable to them, it's the opposite. They're accountable to our families, our teachers, and our school leaders. Flip it around, critically important to any reform that any mayor will have to push. And so I've pushed for that over the years, and I will continue to.
Councilor Campbell, thank you very much. Councilor Sabi George, and by the way, folks, if you need to insert a point here or there after, this is formal, but it's not so formal that you can't improvise. Councilor Sabi George, what?
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you, Philip. I'm happy to jump right in as a former educator here in Boston. I taught high school for 13 years. I'm a graduate of the Boston Public Schools, and my 4 children are in BPS. I also want to note, if I could lighten up the moment just for a minute, we aren't actually in alphabetical order. And as we respond to the education question, I just want to clarify that for the record. I think we're going girls before boys, and that might be the alphabetical order. As Councilor Campbell said, we know the information. This is a place where we have an abundance of data. And we know where the problems are. We know we have to make sure that every school is high quality, that parents are not ranking a high quality school, a first tier school, a second tier school, and a third tier school. Every school in the city of Boston needs to be a high quality school. Every experience in a classroom needs to be high quality for every student. And that is the work that we need to be focused on every single day. It's the work that I have been focused on as an at-large city councilor, as the chair of the education committee, and as my commitment to the people of Boston. We need to make sure that we are focused on literacy, starting in early education, starting in early childcare, and working in partnership with community-based organizations. So when our kids are entering the Boston Public Schools and they are starting their K-12 educational experience with us, that literacy is the core of what we are doing. We need to also, in addition to high school redesign, look at our special education department, see the impacts it has, in particular on our Black and brown boys, as we have too quickly separated them from sort of the general education population. When we talk about the school to prison pipeline, it goes right through the sub-separate classrooms in special education. We have certainly have to look at grade reconfigurations and look at the system as a whole and start off with a full reset. It's the work that I've been chipping away at on the Boston City Council, building a very rigorous academic curriculum and making sure that the support services are in place for our kids, whether it's a full-time nurse in every one of our school buildings, a mental health professional. The next crisis that is here that we are in the midst of is a mental health crisis. As our kids return to the classroom, we need to make sure we are prepared to respond to their needs. If we want them to achieve and excel academically, we need to support them in all of the other ways that they need in order to engage again with the curriculum. We could go on for hours about this topic. The work is urgent and we know what it is. Here we just need partnership to get through it and get it done.
And thank you very much for that. And thank you for pointing out the alphabetical issue. It's actually alphabetical Philip Martin style because I'm going by first names. My which, the type of informality that I usually engage in. Candidate John Barrels, this question again about education and the uses of data and the inequities that are demonstrated by that data. Address that, please. And what more would you like to know from our research group?
Yeah, Philip, thanks a lot. It took me a while to figure out it was first name, so I've got to nudge my colleague here, Anissa, who because typically it goes by last name. But thanks for the question, Philip. I have to agree. I have to disagree a little bit with my colleagues because as a member of the school committee and someone who helped to put together a Promised Neighborhoods application to the Department of Education and looked at all of the factors that we need to follow and understand that impact our children's academic success, we need a whole lot more data. There's too much we don't know, and we don't apply theory long enough in education to do longitudinal studies to understand what's working and then scale it up or change it. Too often, there's changes in leadership and changes in approach, and it doesn't allow us to think about all the factors. What we know in education that there are social factors, like in health, social determinants of academic success. And there's so many of them that we don't spend enough time pushing on homelessness, instability in economic security, food insecurities, other health factors to figure out which one of those are drivers for academic success for our students. Right. And so should we spend more money in housing? Should we spend more money in financial security? Should we spend more money in safe routes to schools? We just don't. We go back and forth. And typically what we do is we'll redo studies that tell us the same thing that we knew before. We know, in fact, that early childhood development, that investing in 0 to 5 is critical for school readiness. We know that knowing how to read by the 3rd grade is critical for success after that, because the curriculum shifts from learning to read to learn. But we don't do enough sustained engagement to allow us to then scale up some of those things that we already know. When you look at your data, there's a correlation between poverty and academic success. It's very clear. There's a correlation between students with certain needs and academic success. So we need to engage the research community to make sure that we are pulling the right levers to have our students succeed in schools. But it needs the city then to look at the services that we provide in some of those areas to make sure that we're putting enough bandwidth into supporting our students to make sure that we can have impact. Let's look at housing, for instance. The city needs to put all of its housing resources towards making sure that all of our students are stably housed before they go to school. When we did a program at Orchard Garden Pilot School, we found that 20% of the students at Orchard Garden Pilot School was instably housed. Everything from couch surfing to being homeless. You can't expect a child to go to school and learn and do their best if they don't have a home to go to do homework. And it's just infeasible. But have we then, created enough intervention in that to shift it enough to do longitudinal study to say, this is where we should put our money? We haven't. And I think we need the research community to stay with us on a long term so that we can scale up the interventions that work for our students.
Okay. All right. Candidate Barrels, thank you. Representative John Santiago, that question about education in Boston and the uses of data. How would you use it, and is it being used correctly now?
Well, thank you, Philip. I would agree with a lot of the sentiments that the folks have said previously. Every child in Boston deserves a world-class education, and that is not what is happening right now. We have a system where 70% of the kids are poor. Almost half are Latino. I see myself in those kids as someone went to BPS. And for me, it wasn't, just because I worked hard, right? There are a lot of kids in the system that work hard, right? it's a matter of opportunity, right? And for me, it was just a couple of opportunities, rather luck, that allowed me to progress, and education was my lifeline. And that's how I got through grade school, went through public school. I've been through community college. I ended up at medical school. So it's been my lifeline. And I want to make sure that every kid in Boston has those same opportunities. And that's why when I ran for office the first time, a big part of that was to make sure that we could pass education reform at the State House. And we did. We voted to pass the Student Opportunity Act, which was a once in a generation education reform bill that sought to address that achievement gap that Philip, you've talked about, and the other folks on this call have talked about. And as mayor, I want to address the achievement gap here in the city of Boston. That has only grown under COVID, mind you, right? And I want to do it by bringing innovation, investment, and incentives. I think, we're going to have an opportunity here, one heck of an opportunity with $400+ million coming into the education system. And what we do about that, and what I've been, suggesting, is that we make sure that that money goes directly to those lowest performing schools, particularly with respect to school maintenance and staffing, to make sure that they have the resources and staffing that they need to succeed. I agree with folks on this call. We need to get to universal preschool for all of Boston children. Learning starts long before folks enter school. It starts at birth, and we need to make sure that we're providing the tools and resources in order for kids to really, benefit from that. But I also want to bring, innovation to this. And I think this is where the research community can play an important and a critically important role in doing. And when, to me, I think about the role of parent engagement. I see some studies that, if parents are more engaged with their students, that they're more associated with doing better in school. And for me, in my district, where I represent the South End and parts of Roxbury, I look at two schools that I live close by: the Hurley School, which is just a couple blocks away, and a half mile away, you have Blackstone Elementary, right? Almost a similar demographic, but one clear difference between the two, when you visit them, when you engage with the students, with their parents, was the amount of parent engagement, right? And so, looking at the research institutions to determine what level of parent engagement showing up, how can we incentivize it? How can we look at programs that, let's consider maybe paying parents to come to an after school program, maybe offering a meal, making sure that it's language accessible and culturally competent. Those are things that I'm looking for the research community to help with as we foster an environment and a situation where parents can get more involved with their student, because I think that is associated with very much improved education outcomes. So things like that, also robust principal mentoring. Another issue that I see is that, the turnover that we see, not just at the highest levels with respect to superintendent, which we've been through like 5 in the past 10 years, I want to say, but also with respect to the principals at the schools. The fact that they don't have the resources to support to get this done, really looking at and fostering an environment and investing in one where principals and staff are mentored or engaged. To me, those are keys that will lead to better outcomes. I'm committed to pursuing those as the next mayor of Boston.
Okay, Representative John Santiago, thank you. Andrea, go on. I'm sorry.
I just want to chime in on a couple of things, since you said just.
Yeah, I did indeed say that.
One thing I think we will need data for going forward is, and there's some now, but it's very limited, is the learning loss, the academic learning loss, and the effect it's having on our students, of course, and their social emotional. The social emotional impacts it's having on our students, our families, of course, our teachers. There's some data out there, of course, that suggests it is exacerbated for special needs students, for English learners, but every student has experienced some kind of learning loss, but we don't know the magnitude of that, and we don't know the impact of that. And I remember hosting a council hearing on this, and that was limited. So that is critically important going forward as we think about the new federal dollars that we are getting, and we want to be targeted. We want to give high dosage tutoring. We want to, of course, make sure that students and educators have access to social workers and mental health clinicians. So that data is going to be critical to drive sort of data-driven solutions to that problem, and to understand the magnitude and what we should do in the fall. And then the second thing I just wanted to stress, and I can't stress this enough, I grew up poor in the city of Boston. I often tell constituents, we are not going to eradicate poverty overnight. Family engagement, yes, critically important. We're not going to make it happen overnight. There are many families that actually engage, but the district fails in not engaging them. The power of education and the power of our school system, at least in the city of Boston, is that, and the ecosystem that surrounds it, is that through our educational system, in the face of circumstances we will not be able to solve overnight, including trauma and violence, we can still, and we should be able to still provide every young person in the city of Boston a high quality education and get them to a place where they're realizing their dreams. There are surrounding school districts that are doing that right now with students who are homeless, with students who are poor. There are, of course, schools within Boston Public Schools that are doing that in the face of those challenges as we address those. And I just wanted to stress that point because this is the system, the education system, that is one critical solution to all of those issues.
Okay. Stick with me for a second, Councillor Campbell. And in fact, I think this particular round, since we have 9 minutes left, which will, in fact, the question itself, you should find your summary. Look for your summary in the answer to the following question, because I think that's the amount of time we're going to have. But let me also mention that we also are interested in another issue here, which is climate change and as well as infrastructure. We may not get to those, but I want to emphasize that it is part of the agenda, and it's something no doubt that you're focused on. At the moment, however, let's talk about economic inclusion. You probably know that GBH News put together a comprehensive and continues to focus on this issue, looking at how public money is spent. And it's called The Color of Public Money. And folks, you can look for that report online. Yeah, that's a shameless plug, I know. But I want to also point out a report by the Black Economic Council of Massachusetts that was done in collaboration with Boston Indicators, showing data from the city that Black and Latinx-owned businesses received far fewer Boston City contracts than would be expected given their availability. This is part of a broader set of disparities regarding the extent to which Black and Latinx entrepreneurs and business people have been able to participate in Boston's economic growth. Question, and quick answer if you can, how do you propose that your administration will work to narrow these gaps? And let's start the other way around with Representative John Santiago.
Great, Philip, very shortly, because we only have a couple minutes left. I mean, what you've expressed here, what you've shown in that graph is absolutely unacceptable, right? You know, business owners, and particularly from communities of color and women, you know, are often overlooked, they're underrepresented and they're underserved, right? I mean, this is one situation where I feel, you know, to the responses from the previous question, where there is enough data. You know, we don't need another study to tell us this. You know, as a scientist, as a physician, you know, sometimes I get very frustrated in the medical community when, you know, there's another study that says, oh, listen, like the poorer you are, the worse your health outcome will be. Like, I get it, you know, and I think this is one of them. What we need is action first and foremost. And as Mayor of Boston, we will do that, right? We will get it done. And, you know, I've committed to making sure that at least 25% of city contracts will be awarded to minority and women businesses, right? We need to make sure that they have the technical expertise, the technical assistance, and the will, as from the city of Boston, to get things done. You know, we don't need a study. We just need political courage. And I'm going to bring that to City Hall.
John, candidate John Barrows, Chief Economic Development, your answer to that question.
Thank you, Philip. I appreciate it. And so once again, I'm going to disagree with my colleague. We do need data on this. The source of this chart comes from the city's disparity study, which I commissioned, came out of my budget as Chief of Economic Development. And the reason why we did that is not because we didn't know. The reason why we did that is we have to set the legal framework by which, in fact, we can set goals. And if you don't do that, like wasn't done in prior administrations, it gets knocked down by the courts. And so you need a robust disparity study, which is a legal document that shows the disparity. So in fact, you can implement race-based goals. And that's what we have, race-based and now gender goals that were signed into place because of the study by Mayor Walsh before he left. So we actually do have goals with 25% spend with women-owned and minority-owned businesses in the city of Boston, the highest goals we've ever had in history. We have never had at any time in Boston's history proportionate spend to women and minority-owned businesses in Boston. Hopefully we can do that now. And then we've set the goal for $170 million to $180 million worth of spend. It'll be a lot of spend, but that's because of the availability that we have. We could use more data to understand, if we tweak the question a little bit, is there more availability out there with women-owned businesses and minority-owned businesses to do business with the city? That means if you ask the question, if we provided a $25,000 grant to small businesses, would they be willing to work with the city? I think you would see availability shoot up, and then maybe make up the opportunity to work with them. You would then create a higher goal as a city. But right now, we're doing it based on what we know, and this is a very legal document. So I appreciate you giving credit to BECMA and Boston Indicators, but in fact, look at the footnote of that chart, and you'll see that comes from the city's efforts to make sure that we rectify the situation.
Okay, Councilor Sabi George, that same question to you.
We know that this report confirmed what we've all known. And I think what's very interesting is we are talking about what we will do as mayor. We are all in certain capacities that we can act on it today, that we can do this work in our current capacities. And I've done that as an at-large city councilor, as a member of the Boston City Council. We filed a home rule petition to make some actual legislative changes at the state level to ensure that we are very intentional in our efforts to give women and business owners of color an opportunity at city contracts, and not just the access to it, but make sure that we are holding firm on the shifts that we need to make. So when this last study came out a couple of months ago, we filed at the city council through my office, I filed a home rule petition to make this change happen, because we do have to continue these conversations, continue the collection of data, continue thinking about and working and moving on ways to change what's happening right now. And we talk about this far fewer, we talk about narrowing the gaps. It is so unbalanced, and so this far fewer is not an accurate measurement. There is nothing for some and a lot for others, and to flip that, to balance that, it takes legislative action and change, and it's not something we have to wait until any one of us is mayor to do. We need to do it today, and that's what I've done as a city councilor. I've moved on this, and we're working on that process through the city council now, and look forward to working in partnership with Rep. Santiago to get that through the State House once that home rule petition is passed the city council.
Thank you very much. Councilor Campbell, that question to you, it's 10:42, and in our remaining time, have you answer that. Then I'm going to see if I can give you 30 seconds each to sort of sum up.
Thank you, Philip, for the question. And I do want to thank BECMA, the whole host of organizations that have been pushing on these issues for a really long time. Because the problem is what that report revealed is what we already knew, that businesses run by women and people of color were being left behind, not just by the city of Boston, frankly, by the private sector, by hospitals, the meds and the eds, all industries. If they look at whether or not their businesses are diverse, we are all failing. And so number one, data I think is important, and we do have the data, we do. To release it though, for everyone to see it every single day, you go on the City of Boston's website, you should see all of our dollars, our $3.7 billion budget, where is that money going and who's getting these contracts? We should see that. And then I think we would determine where do we go from there. Setting goals is one thing. We need every department to buy into why it is important that contracts go to diverse businesses. It helps the city grow. It helps all of us economically. And so people who are actually doing the procuring in the city of Boston need training. People in doing the procuring need to know how to hit these targets. Maybe we incentivize them, but we have to have levers of accountability as well as targets in these departments, critically important. Once the city of Boston sets the lead, then we push on the eds in the meds in the private sector to diversify not just their supplier relationships, but also their businesses. Who are their lawyers? Who are their accountants? We have to think expansive on this. And lastly, I would say I'm a lawyer. I'm the only lawyer I think on this panel. And I will say it doesn't take so long. With some level of intentionality, policy development, and change, we are able to actually accomplish these goals and to really drive equity in everything we do with intentionality and a sense of urgency. And of course, funneling that equity lens through every department and every city employee and the city of Boston as a whole.
I can tell you right now, we have a rich array of candidates for mayor, and I applaud all of you. Thank you very much for your participation in this discussion around data. Other issues I'd like to just point out that we'd like you to keep in mind and to discuss perhaps at a future date very shortly. Particularly at the top of that list is the issue of climate change. It's something that it's impacting all of us, but also the issue of infrastructure, roads, and then non-traditional infrastructure. That too we'd like to keep in mind. And so if you will, I'd like to ask our audience to join me in applauding Councillor Andrea Campbell, Councillor Sabi George, candidate John Barrows, Chief Economic Development, and Representative John Santiago. And I'd like to also thank Dan O'Brien, Alita Ristia, and David Braid for putting this together. Thank you kindly. Dan, is there something you'd like to add as we head out?
I just want to say thank you. Thank you to you, Philip, for guiding us through the wilds here. Fantastic job moderating. I really appreciate it. And I know the audience did as well. And to the candidates, I'm going to disagree with Philip. I'm going to go alphabetic last name. Just to be contrarian for the morning. So candidate Barros, Councillor Campbell, Councillor Sabi George, Representative Santiago, thank you so much for taking the time to have this conversation with us. I learned a lot. And also I have a bunch of notes that I'm going to be sending out to friends and students and colleagues. These are the answers that we need to start generating for these folks. So thank you so much and best of luck as the campaign wears on.
Thank you, everyone.
Have a great day.
Thank you. Bye now.
Thank you, everybody.